The day my parents told me they couldn't afford my college, they said it like it was a small inconvenience, not a decision that would split my life in two. My mother kept wiping an already clean counter. My father stared at a notebook filled with numbers he trusted more than he trusted me. They explained that money was tight, that sacrifices had to be made, and that Rachel's school came first because her opportunity was once in a lifetime. I nodded, because in our house nodding meant the conversation was over. Rachel didn't look uncomfortable. She stood there holding her acceptance packet, already talking about dorms and meal plans, already living in a future that had been paid for. I went to my room that night and stared at the ceiling, realizing no one had asked what I wanted, or how I would make it work, or whether I was scared. They assumed I'd figure it out. I always did. I figured it out by working 2 jobs and filling out scholarship forms at midnight. I figured it out by choosing the state university no one bragged about. I figured it out by learning how to stretch time and energy until there was nothing left but discipline. When my parents paid Rachel's tuition checks, they talked about how generous they were. When I paid mine, no one talked at all. Family dinners became a performance. My father listed Rachel's achievements like bullet points in a presentation. My mother asked me if my classes were manageable. I smiled and said yes, because saying no wouldn't have changed anything. I stopped bringing my grades home. I stopped mentioning awards. Not because I was hiding, but because no one was looking. I studied in break rooms and laundromats. I listened to lectures while bussing tables. I borrowed textbooks and returned them early so no one could say I was asking for too much. Professors started to notice. They asked questions. They challenged me. They remembered my name. That alone felt unreal. Rachel called sometimes, complaining about pressure, about expectations, about how hard it was to be supported. I listened. I congratulated her. I hung up before resentment could turn into something uglier. I didn't want to be bitter. I wanted to be better. By my junior year, I realized something important. Being overlooked meant I was free. No one interfered. No one took credit. Every inch forward was mine. I poured everything into my work, not to prove them wrong, but because it was the only way out. Senior year arrived quietly. I was tired all the time. One afternoon, while I was wiping down tables at work, my phone buzzed with an email. It said I was ranked first in my graduating class. I reread it until the words felt real. Then I went back to work. There was no one to call, no one to celebrate with, just a calm certainty settling in my chest. Graduation day came with bright lights and loud families. The auditorium buzzed with pride. I didn't expect to see my parents, but they were there, front row, focused on Rachel. She was graduating too. They assumed they knew how the story ended. The dean spoke about excellence and perseverance. Names were called. Applause rose and fell. Then he paused and announced the valedictorian. He said my name clearly, confidently, like it belonged there. For a moment, my parents didn't react. My mother's smile froze. My father turned, searching for someone else to stand. Rachel looked stunned. Then I stood, and the room erupted. I walked across the stage in clothes I paid for myself, carrying a future no one had funded but me. The dean shook my hand and told the audience about my workload, my jobs, my record. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't need to. I felt the shift happen anyway. Afterward, people congratulated me. Professors hugged me. A graduate program representative handed me a card and said they'd been watching me for years. My parents approached last. My mother asked why I hadn't told them. My father said they would have helped if they'd known. I smiled politely and said I didn't think they were interested. It wasn't cruel. It was true. That summer, I moved into a small apartment near campus, fully funded, fully independent. My parents offered help then. I declined. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed permission or approval to stand where I stood. They paid for my sister's college. They didn't pay for mine. But when the dean called my name, they finally understood the cost of that choice. A few weeks after graduation, My mother started calling more often. Small questions at first. How was my apartment? Was the neighborhood safe? Did I need anything? Each question felt like an apology she didn't know how to say. I answered kindly, briefly, without opening doors I had already learned to close. My father invited me to lunch, just the two of us. He talked about his coworkers, about retirement plans, about how proud he was of both his daughters now. He said now like it mattered. I listened and nodded, the same way I had years ago, except this time the nod didn't cost me anything. Rachel struggled that year. Student loans arrived with interest and pressure. She called less. When she did, her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It was uncertain. She asked how I managed, how I stayed focused without help. I told her the truth. I said you learn fast when no one is coming to save you. Graduate school was demanding, but different. I belonged there. My work wasn't a surprise or a burden. It was expected, funded, respected. For the first time, success didn't feel like a rebellion. It felt normal. At a family gathering that winter, an aunt pulled me aside and said she'd heard about my speech, about my scholarship, about how impressive it all was. My parents stood nearby, listening carefully, saying nothing. They didn't correct her. They didn't redirect the praise. They just absorbed it, like people finally reading a headline they should have noticed years ago. I realized then that revenge had already passed. There was no dramatic confrontation coming. No apology big enough to rewrite the past. There was only distance, clarity, and a quiet shift in power that no one could undo. They still introduce Rachel as the one they supported. They introduce me as the one who did it on her own. And for the first time, that difference doesn't hurt. It defines me. I didn't need them to choose me. I chose myself, over and over, when it was hardest. And when my name was called in that auditorium, it wasn't just an honor. It was proof that being overlooked didn't make me small. It made me unstoppable. Time moved on, the way it always does, carrying new routines and quieter victories with it. My days filled with research deadlines, presentations, and long nights in the lab. People asked for my opinion. They trusted my work. I stopped flinching when someone said my name with respect. My parents tried, in their own awkward way, to be part of my progress. Articles were forwarded. Achievements were shared in the family group chat. My mother started saying, "My daughter the scholar," careful not to say which one. I let it happen without correcting her. Correction was no longer my job. Rachel visited once, sitting on the edge of my couch, looking around my small but steady life. She admitted she felt lost without constant guidance. I told her that independence is terrifying until it isn't. We talked like adults, not competitors. That was new for both of us. At school, an opportunity came up that changed everything. A national fellowship. Highly selective, fully funded. When I got the acceptance email, I didn't rush to tell anyone. I went for a walk, let the moment settle, and realized how different this felt from the first time I'd been overlooked. This time, recognition wasn't shocking. It was earned and expected. At the next family dinner, my father mentioned the fellowship to a relative before I did. He said my name with pride that felt practiced, but real. I noticed how carefully he spoke, as if afraid to get it wrong again. Later that night, my mother pulled me aside. She didn't apologize outright. She said, "We didn't see it back then." I nodded. She was right. They hadn't. And they couldn't change that. What they could change was how they treated me now. And what I could change was how much that mattered. I left that dinner early, not out of discomfort, but because my life was waiting somewhere else. Walking to my car, I felt something unfamiliar and solid. Peace. Not because they finally saw me, but because I had stopped needing them to. The years that followed settled into a rhythm I had built myself. Conferences replaced family dinners. Colleagues replaced the constant need for approval. I learned how to speak about my work without shrinking it, without apologizing for how far I had come. My parents watched from a distance now. They asked before offering advice. They listened more than they spoke. Sometimes my mother would say she wished she'd done things differently. Sometimes my father would say nothing at all, which told me more than words ever had. Rachel found her own footing eventually. Not the path she'd been handed, but one she had to work for. We talked occasionally, honestly. There was no rivalry left to feed. Just two women shaped by very different versions of the same family. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a commencement ceremony. Standing at the podium, looking out at students who reminded me of myself, I told them the truth. That support matters, but self-belief matters more. That being chosen is nice, but choosing yourself is what changes everything. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't need to. The lesson had already lived inside me long enough to speak for itself. When I stepped off the stage, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. She said she'd watched the live stream. She said she was proud. I stared at the screen for a moment, then replied with a simple, "Thank you." That night, alone in my apartment, I thought about the girl who had nodded quietly in the kitchen years ago. The girl who had been told there wasn't enough to go around. I wished I could tell her what I know now. That she didn't lose anything by being overlooked. She gained herself. Not long after that, my father had a health scare. Nothing dramatic, but enough to slow him down and make him reflective in a way I hadn't seen before. He called me one evening, his voice quieter, less certain. He said he'd been thinking about the choices he made when we were younger, about what he called practical decisions, and what I understood as emotional ones. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't explain. He just said, "I should have paid more attention." I let the silence sit between us. Then I said, "I learned to pay attention to myself." That was the most honest response I had. When I visited home after that, the house felt smaller. The walls still held the old patterns, but they no longer trapped me. My childhood room looked like a museum exhibit of a person I no longer was. I closed the door gently when I left it. At dinner, my parents asked about my work, and they waited for the answer. No interruptions, no comparisons. Rachel listened too. For the first time, it felt like we were all in the same room at the same time, not acting out different stories. On the drive back, I realized something subtle but powerful. I wasn't carrying anger anymore. Not because it had been resolved, but because it had lost its usefulness. It had pushed me forward once. Now it was just weight. Success had given me options. Distance had given me clarity. And time had given me the freedom to decide how close I wanted to be. I chose balance. Not erasing the past, not living inside it either. Some stories end with apologies or triumph. Mine ended with understanding. They paid for my sister's college and not mine. That fact never changed. But what it built inside me changed everything. And in the end, that was the education that mattered most. Years later, when people asked about my family, I answered simply. I didn't rewrite the story to make it softer, and I didn't sharpen it to make a point. I told it the way it happened. Some nodded with understanding. Some looked uncomfortable. That wasn't my problem anymore. My parents aged into quieter versions of themselves. They stopped making grand plans for my life and started asking what made me happy. Sometimes they caught themselves favoring old habits, and sometimes they corrected them. Progress came in inches, not leaps. I accepted that. Rachel and I found something close to peace. Not closeness built on competition or comparison, but respect earned the hard way. She once admitted she envied my independence. I told her independence wasn't a gift. It was a skill learned under pressure. She understood that. At work, my name carried weight. Not because of where I came from, but because of what I had done. Each milestone felt quieter than the last, less about proving anything and more about alignment. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. One evening, I attended a small alumni event at my old university. The same auditorium, the same stage. I sat in the back and watched students nervously clutch programs, families whispering encouragement. I smiled, remembering how it felt to stand alone and still be enough. When I left, I passed the podium and ran my fingers along its edge. No bitterness, no regret. Just gratitude for the version of me who kept going when it would have been easier to stop. They never paid for my education, but they unknowingly funded something else. My resilience, my clarity, my refusal to be small, and that return on investment lasted a lifetime. On my way out of that building, a student stopped me and asked if I'd really done it all on my own. There was fear in her eyes, the kind that comes from standing at the edge of an uncertain future. I told her the truth. I said yes, but I also said it wasn't heroic. It was necessary. And necessity can turn into strength if you let it. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me how close I had once been to giving up quietly, to accepting the version of myself my parents had unknowingly written for me. I understood then that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to anyone who had been overlooked and still kept showing up. My parents never fully stopped trying to make amends. Sometimes they sent money I didn't ask for. Sometimes they offered connections I no longer needed. I accepted their care in measured ways, without letting it rewrite the truth of how I got here. Love, I learned, doesn't have to come with erasure. Rachel and I met for coffee one afternoon, years after everything had settled. She told me she finally understood how heavy expectations could be when they're handed to you instead of earned. We laughed softly at how differently we had been shaped by the same home. There was no winner anymore, just survivors of different pressures. As my career grew, so did my sense of grounding. I mentored students who reminded me of myself. I paid for their textbooks anonymously. I wrote recommendation letters late at night, knowing exactly how much they mattered. This was the kind of support I once needed, and now I could give it freely. One evening, alone in my apartment, I looked at a photo from graduation day. Not the stage moment, but the one taken afterward, when the crowd had thinned and the noise had faded. I was smiling, not wide or proud, but calm, certain. That was the moment everything changed, even if no one noticed right away. Because from then on, my life wasn't about catching up or proving worth. It was about choosing what came next, on my own terms. Later, when I was asked to join the board of a small education nonprofit, I hesitated at first. It felt strange to step into a role where decisions affected other people's futures. But that hesitation reminded me why I said yes. I knew exactly what it meant when a single choice could open or close a door. At the first meeting, budgets were discussed. Scholarships debated, numbers moved across spreadsheets. I watched carefully, remembering my father's notebook, the pen tapping, the silence that followed. When the vote came down to funding one more student, I spoke up. I didn't tell my story. I didn't have to. I just said potential doesn't always announce itself loudly. The motion passed. Driving home, I realized something quietly profound. I was no longer reacting to my past. I was shaping someone else's future. The power in that didn't feel like revenge. It felt like responsibility. My parents came to visit that spring. We walked through a park near my apartment, the conversation light, almost ordinary. My mother asked what I was most proud of. I thought about awards, titles, milestones. Then I told her the truth. I said I was proud that I never quit on myself, even when it would have made things easier for everyone else. She nodded slowly, like she was finally listening. That night, after they left, I sat by the window and watched the city lights come on one by one. I felt no need to replay old scenes or imagine different outcomes. The story had already resolved itself, not with a dramatic ending, but with a steady, earned sense of belonging in my own life. They paid for my sister's college, and not mine. The dean called my name as valedictorian. But the real victory came later, in moments no one applauded. In the quiet certainty that I had built a life that didn't require permission. As time passed, that certainty only deepened. I stopped measuring my life against milestones that impressed other people and started noticing the small, solid things that made my days feel whole. Morning light through my windows, work that challenged me without breaking me, knowing exactly how much I could rely on myself. Occasionally, someone from my past would bring up the old story like it was a dramatic turning point. They'd ask if it still hurt, if I still felt angry, if I thought it was unfair. I told them the truth. It was unfair. It was painful. And it was also the reason I learned how strong I could be without an audience. My parents never stopped trying to reinsert themselves into the narrative, to claim pride as if it had always been there. I let them have their version. Mine was already complete. I didn't need validation layered on after the fact. Rachel and I settled into something honest. We didn't pretend our childhood had been equal. We didn't compete over who had it harder. We simply acknowledged that we were shaped differently, and that difference didn't need to be resolved to be respected. One evening, after a long day, I found an old notebook while cleaning out a drawer. Inside were schedules, budget plans, handwritten goals from years ago. Pages filled with determination from a version of me who had no safety net and no guarantees. I sat on the floor and laughed softly, not out of sadness, but admiration. She had carried me here. I closed the notebook and put it back, not as a reminder of struggle, but as proof of continuity. I had never been lost. I had always been moving forward, even when no one noticed. They paid for my sister's college. They didn't pay for mine. But the moment my name echoed through that auditorium didn't just mark an ending. It marked the beginning of a life built on self-trust, quiet power, and a strength that never needed permission to exist.